lifecycle methods are onStart and onStop. Straight away you can see how those are opposites, okay? So we'll look at these two together. OnStart happens immediately after onCreate, and onStop happens just before onDestroy, okay? So there's a certain symmetry to this. We don't get much of a clue as to what happens just before onStart. It is just onCreate, and also sometimes this onRestart method, but don't worry about this, okay? So onStart happens straight after onCreate, but onStop happens when the activity is no longer visible, but not destroyed. So we'll definitely be able to do some things with the phone that will trigger this situation. Let's jump back now into Android Studio. So if I close the logcat, I'll leave all the previous logs in because that will help us. And straight after onCreate, I'm going to start typing onStart and autocomplete. And then again, after onStart, but before onDestroy, I'm going to start typing onStop. And I'll copy one of these previous logs, so the onCreate one. After super.onStart, I will paste that and change it to I'm in onStart. And then same for onStop. After the super method, I will call log.d, I'm in onStop. We'll go ahead now and run the app and just have a quick look and see what happens here. What do we expect? Well, back on the diagram, the three things that happen prior to the activity running and being able to be interacted with are onCreate, onStart, and onResume. And then the activity is running. So we should expect to see the onCreate log and the onStart log just happen. And then we're here, activity is on the screen, the user can play with it. And then from this point, we'll talk about what we can do to trigger onPause, onStop, and onDestroy, particularly the onStop method that we're looking at right now. So let's go ahead and run this app. I'll open logcat, I'll clear any previous logs, and just click rerun. I'll just move this emulator a little bit out of the way to the top left there. Okay, so I'm in onCreate, I'm in onStart. So remembering that diagram, it said when the activity is no longer visible. But we don't want to destroy it. In fact, if I were to destroy it with the back button, for example, or even the exit activity button, well, we see I'm in the button click listener, I'm in onStop, I'm now in onDestroy. So that calls onStop and onDestroy. But if I go ahead now, I'll just clear the logs and then open the activity again. Okay, I'm in onCreate and I'm in onStart. Well, now I don't want onDestroy to happen, I just want onStop to happen. And that happens when the activity is no longer visible. Well, how could we do that? Simply by pressing the home button. So let's press home. The activity is no longer visible, and indeed I'm in onStop happens. So we'll just quickly go back to the diagram to see how we can get onStart to happen, but not onCreate. Well, it says when the user then navigates to the activity again, the activity that's already running, well, there'll be a method called onRestart, but we don't really need to worry about this. I've never seen anybody override this or have any use for that because of these two methods here, onStart and onResume, so don't worry about the onRestart method. We can see after they go back to the activity, the one that's already running, then onStart should be called in this loop. So let's go ahead and do that. So back to Android Studio. So the activity is still in the background, it's not been destroyed, but it's been stopped. If I go to my task switcher and load it again, onStart. I can go background, onStop. I can also open it from the drawer, onStart. Okay? And if I finally want to close it for good, I can press the back button, onStop, and then onDestroy then happen. So onStart and onStop are pretty simple. Whenever the activity is no longer visible, but not destroyed, for example, it's been backgrounded, or indeed, let's try one more example, I'll clear the logs, you could have the app running, you could click the task switcher button. Well, it calls onStop there because this isn't actually your activity, it's the task switcher app, so your activity is no longer visible, okay? So you can switch activities to do that also. Okay, so we can hook into this, and we'll talk later on as to some of the reasons why we might do this and why this might be useful. But we are able to know through these lifecycle methods when the user is coming in and out of our app to maybe say refresh some data whenever they come back to the app. That's a very common use case. But that's pretty much all there is to know with onStart and onStop. So let's move on now to the final two of our 6 lifecycle methods. And that just leaves us with the final pair of lifecycle methods, onResume and onPause. Now we can see before onPause a bit of text that says another activity comes into the foreground, whereas onStop says the activity is no longer visible. OnResume and onPause can seem at first glance very similar to onStart and onStop. There is a very, very subtle difference between the two, and the best way for us to find out is by doing this in practice. So let's jump right back to Android Studio. And if I just clear logcat and then close it down. So we have onCreate and onStart, and then we have onStop and onDestroy, the two pairs of lifecycle methods. So after onStart, let's do the onResume method. So type onResume and then override. Okay, and then under onResume, but before onStop, the opposing method onPause. So onPause and onResume are closely related. And the first thing we'll do is put some log messages in both of those. So I'll copy this one here, delete that line break, and after super.onResume, I'll do I'm in onResume, and the same for onPause. I'm in onPause. And we'll go ahead now and run the app and just see, hopefully, all three of these starting methods, onCreate, then onStart, then onResume, but then nothing should happen until we start to leave the app. Okay, let's try this. So run. Okay, and if I load up logcat, I'm in onCreate, I'm in onStart, I'm in onResume, and we can start interacting with our app now. And then if I leave the app, either with the says the 6 log off again, foreground. In the logcat, the 3 happens before go in order, then resume, the foreground. But onStop is for when the activity is no longer visible. So the key distinction there is if some activity is launched and comes on top of our app, but we can still see our activity behind it, it's actually visible on the screen to the user, then onPause will happen, but onStop won't. Okay, so onStop is when you background to the app and the app is not visible anymore. OnPause is when something jumps on top of the activity, so some other activity, either in our app or another app, but it's not completely covering our activity. Our activity is still visible somewhere behind it. Now, if I just jump back to Android Studio and the emulator, so these days, this is not incredibly common to get an activity, not a fragment, but an activity that is on top of your app, on top of your activity, but with some of your activity behind it. Pretty much most activities these days are full screen. A really common one from days gone by is when you receive a phone call, sometimes you'd get an activity that is like a dialogue. It's kind of a square or a rectangle in the middle of the screen, but you could still see your app behind it. That was an old way that some phones used to do incoming calls. That would call on pause, but not on stop, because you can still see your activity. There is a way for me to show you how to do this. It's a bit clunky, it's a bit hacky. You don't need to copy this, but it will show you kind of what I mean. So I'm going to make another activity in our app. I'll do it the manual way. I'll do new Kotlin class, and I'll call it a non-full screen activity. So this is going to be an activity that does not take up the full screen that we can launch. Doing this from scratch, I'll extend app.compat activity, not forgetting the brackets. I'm not even going to bother doing onCreate. I'm not going to put any view here. It's just going to be an empty window, so we'll have no methods at all. But what I will do is I'll put it in the manifest that I've already got here. So if I close down logcat, you can see we've already got our main activity there. So I'm going to make another activity, as you would do if you were making a new screen in your app. And I'll make it a non-full screen activity. But now I'm going to give it a style, a theme, which will give it the effect of not being full screen. So I'll do theme, and it's a style, and it is one from the default Android library. It's called theme.appcompat.dialog. So this is quite an old-fashioned theme you can use for activities, and this will essentially make activity, as the style says, a dialog, not full screen, a pop-up that sits on top. Okay, it's going to look a bit weird because we've got nothing in our set content view. It's going to be an empty dialog, but it will show you the effect of something coming on top of our activity that is not full screen, so we can still see our activity behind it. And this is a way that we can simulate the effect of on pause and on resume. As mentioned, these days it's not terribly common that something sits on top. A real-world example might be something like a popular messaging app like Facebook or WhatsApp. Some of them use a kind of overlay chat box that appears on top but isn't full screen. You may or may not have seen this, but it's basically a mini version of the app in a floating window. And when these things come, that would also trigger on pause because you could still see your activity behind it. If you've not seen such an effect, let me make some code so we can launch this new screen, and I'll show you exactly what this looks like. So in main activity, I'm going to change our exit button. I'm going to comment out the finish code, and rather than finishing the activity, I'm going to do an intent to launch our new class, the non-full screen activity. So we'll do start activity, and I'm going to make a new intent object right here inside this intent, this for this screen, and then a non-full screen activity class.java. Okay, you can see here I've put the intent directly inside start activity. I could have done this, I could have made a variable and done it that way. That's also fine, but sometimes you don't need the variable, so you can put it directly inside like I've done. Okay, so when we click the exit button, it's not going to exit, it's going to launch this dialog activity, which is not full screen, and hopefully we'll look at logcat and see the effect of on pause and on resume happening, but not on stop. So let's run this now, and open logcat, and I can see I'm on create, I'm on start, I'm on resume. I'm actually going to clear logcat so we can see exactly what's going on. Okay, so when I click the exit activity button, it's going to launch this new activity, and this new activity has this dialog style, very old-fashioned style that isn't really used much anymore, and that's going to make it not full screen. So let's see what happens. Okay, do you see that? So we have this strange kind of empty dialog with a grayed out background. Some apps like WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger have this kind of floating version of their app, but it's not full screen. Very similar effect to what I'm doing here, okay? And you'll see I'm in on pause happens only. If I were then to completely background our app with the home button, then we get I'm in on stop because our app is no longer visible. So I'll resume our app. So I'm in on start happens because our app is visible again, but on resume does not happen because it's not in the foreground. Okay, so this strange dialog is in the foreground. When I press back to go back to the previous screen, I'm in on resume. So on pause and on resume is to do with foreground and background. Okay, here, our app is still visible, but it's in the background, so on pause happens. Okay, and if I go back, on resume happens, it's back in the foreground. If I close the app, so it's no longer visible, we get on pause and on stop. And if then I go back to the app, we get on start and on resume. So looking at the code, and closing logcat, on resume and on start are very similar. But if I should do a quick comment, this is for when our app, having flown through those 6 lifecycle methods, you might at this point be a little bit confused or overwhelmed, thinking, how am I supposed to know when a good time is to use these, or do I even need to worry about all of these methods? Because I remember initially being daunted by lifecycle methods, as I mentioned previously in this section. So a really useful thing now will be to go through some real-world use cases for when you might use some of these methods, and then put them into practice to see what this looks like. Because the simple truth is, on a day-to-day basis, you probably won't need to use all or even most of these, but there may be times when you need to use 1 or 2 of them to do something important in your app. So let's go through a few really common use cases for some of these lifecycle methods. So the first is the concept of refreshing data. Many apps these days have some sort of feed where when you first open the app, it's just a list of new content. It could be news or your social media timeline or messages. And you may load this in onCreate when you first open the app. But then if the user switches between many apps, they close your app, they put your app in the background, they go to some other app, they check the emails, and then they switch back to your app. Well, if your app was just put in the background with a home button, for example, rather than being completely closed, well, we know that onCreate wouldn't happen. So refreshing data to update content when a user returns to your app. But this is with your app possibly already running in the background. So how could we go about doing this? Well, as you might remember, there's a couple of methods we could use, on start and then on resume. But in the real world, from my experience, typically it's done in on resume. And the reason for that is this is the method that is guaranteed to happen just before you come back to your app, just before it is fully running. There are 1 or 2 situations where it's possible that on start wouldn't happen, like something pops up on top of your app, but you can still see your app in the background. So doing it in on resume, the final method before your activity is running, is a really safe place to do this. And in my experience working on many teams, many projects, people tend to refresh and update their app in the on resume method. And in the next tutorial, I'll show you how this might be done, or what this might look like using the lifecycle method on resume. So that's one really common use case to refresh a user's data whenever they come back to your app, so they're guaranteed to always have the most up-to-date feed or timeline. Another use case would be pausing some activity in your activity. Okay, so you might have something happening in your app, like for example a game, or maybe just simply a running timer, like a stopwatch. But you maybe don't want that to keep running if the user were to switch their app for any reason. So you're able to automatically pause any running action in your app by using these lifecycle methods. And probably quite obviously, the best method to do this, in my opinion, would be in the onPause. This means if some other app interrupts in any way at all, and this might even include a floating dialog like WhatsApp or some messaging app putting a little mini window on top of your app. So even if your app is still in the background and visible, you might want to pause what's going on as the user can't interact with it. You know, they're not currently looking directly at your screen, they're looking at something else. So just like it says in the name, onPause is a really good method if you want to stop any running action. And again, in a couple of tutorials time, I'll show you an example of this and what this might look like in code. And finally, another common use case might be to clean up before you exit. Now, I put clean up in inverted commas because this can be many things. It could be saving the user's game before they leave. It could be storing some important data so the user doesn't lose their data. If the user were to suddenly leave your app by pressing back or by swiping out of memory, you might want to do some last-minute things like saving data, ending sessions, resetting the app to a certain state, so that the next time the user opens your app, they're exactly where you want them. So you can try and clean up by ending any sort of in-app session like a game, or saving data, or resetting things. Now, onDestroy can be used if the user is exiting the app, but I've put here, we need to be careful. onDestroy is not always guaranteed to run. Now, I will do a quick example in a few tutorials time showing the cleanup idea, and I'll show some Android documentation which says exactly this, that onDestroy is not a guarantee. There might be some things that have happened in the system which means it might not run. So this notion of cleaning up is not always 100%, and I will show this in practice before leading into a much better alternative for your users. But you could still try to do some app cleanup before the user leaves your app, and the way to do this would be to use the onDestroy method. Let's now jump into coding some real-world examples of these three use cases so you can see what this means in practice using the lifecycle methods.